No, I
Settled in,
don't.
stuff working.
Right.
I'll change
Did you operate the state this morning? Oh, this morning? Okay. I thought you were listening and they weren't.
No, it's most likely. I can go to all of You got experience while you're here.
I am a cowboy.
I've seen
Anything too sub.
Remember, he stuck out.
want anybody that does research
I was like, hopefully in a good way. Thank you.
I happened to be in the
We're seeing decades of degradation, pollution, nutrient pollution, excess phosphorus, nitrogen entering the Everglades.
FIU is uniquely posed to address these really challenging environmental problems because those problems really are in need of a holistic solution.
The university here, its researchers, its faculty, its students are being taught to be collaborative in order to solve our environmental challenges. And we face many. Collaboration is critical. And FIU, through all of its efforts, through all of its abilities to reach beyond this institution, collaboration, in my view, has been one of its keys to success.
When you give to FIU, those dollars just go straight to research and students. They are the innovators and the problem solvers of the future. We're really solving problems that matter so much to us as Floridians, but to every citizen really of the planet.
We're supposed to laugh, I guess.
Good afternoon, everybody. So on behalf of Miami's Public Research University, welcome to FIU in Washington, D.C., our very own embassy in our nation's capital. And for those of you visiting from Florida, consider this your home away from home, too. My name is Leah Goodman. I'm a senior at FIU studying political science and environmental studies pursuing water policy. This semester, I'm interning with Congressman Jared Moskowitz on Capitol Hill, but I'm also a Hamilton Scholar focusing on policy related to environmental resilience. Like this program, my project is on exploring how the Everglades restoration supports communities in South Florida build resilience to the harmful effects of sea level rise and climate change. We're excited about today's program, which is focused on our national treasure, the River of Grass. And we're so proud and honored to have collaborated on today's program with our partners, the Everglades Foundation. We hope that you learned some from our experts on our panel. in particular on some emerging new proposed methods at assessing the impacts of Everglades restoration projects. We expect this to be interactive as we have so much to learn from you and our audience and those tuned in online. We're excited that we have here a great mix of state, local, and federal stakeholders, including such a strong representation from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and South Florida Water Management District, representatives from the Miccosukee and Seminole tribes, our congressional delegation, which have been strong champions, and our research and scientific community, including our wonderful partners with University of Florida and the University of Central Florida. Now, before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge some very special guests here today. From the Everglades Foundation, we have the Vice President of Policy, Bradley Watson. We have U.S. Army Corps. From the Jacksonville District, Commander James Booth. And now, to welcome us and introduce our next section, I introduce Dr. Todd Crowell, who leads our FIU Institute of Environment.
Welcome, everybody. It's my great privilege to introduce Dr. Steve Davis, who will be moderating today's panel. Dr. Davis is the chief scientist for the Everglades Foundation. Prior to coming to South Florida, he was a professor at Texas A&M for 10 years. He's a globally known expert in coastal wetlands, published books, many papers, and a leading scientist and researcher, part of the FCE that we run at Florida International University. So, Dr. Davis, if you would come up. Oh, you're right.
Well, thank you. This is really an honor to be here at FIU DC, and I've got to get one of these. It's actually emitting a little bit of warmth, so it's nice. And for the folks that are standing in the back, there are plenty of seats up here, so if you'd like to sit up front, please feel free to do so. I'm going to give a little bit of background on the panel, and then I'm going to ask the panelists to come up as a group as I introduce them. And again, just thank FIU and Carlos and Todd and Rita for helping to organize this session. I know it was a lot of effort to bring this together and to coincide with the task force meeting. We're really delighted to be here. As many of you know, Everglades restoration represents a massive replumbing effort and infrastructure for South Florida. And we know that this is designed to improve conditions for ecosystems ranging from lakes and rivers to estuaries and, of course, freshwater and coastal wetlands, while also maintaining critical services that allow us to survive and live in South Florida, like water supply and flood protection. And so it sort of transcends the environmental benefits. When we think of Everglades restoration, you're increasingly hearing about the economic contributions of this as well, and often cited 4-to-1 return on investment. Critical projects that are under construction, such as the Central Everglades Plan, and especially the Everglades Agricultural Area Reservoir, we know will redirect billions of gallons of clean fresh water back to the Everglades, ultimately to coastal wetlands and estuaries in the south, areas that have been impacted by decades of lack of freshwater flow, but we also know sea level rise. And we think back to when SERP was being planned, we didn't fully understand sort of what the realities would be 10, 20, 30 years into the future. And so it's important to think about the implications of that. But fortunately, a tenet of Everglades restoration was adaptive management, the ability to sort of learn and adapt as we go. But with the pace of change and the science we're gathering, we've learned more about the risks associated not only to the natural systems, but also to our communities. And recognizing the need to build resilience is increasingly understood as being an important objective of this effort, not only for our natural systems, but for our communities that are tied to this. And many of you are familiar that the National Academy of Sciences, every 2 years, performs a review of Everglades restoration progress that they submit to Congress. These are incredibly important and valuable reports, and certainly for the students that aren't familiar with these reports, I encourage you to check them out. The Committee for the Independent Scientific Review of Everglades Restoration Progress. It's a mouthful and a horrible acronym, but CISRIP is what it is. And I've just pulled a couple of excerpts from past biennial reports, and I'll keep this very short. One from 2014, so almost 10 years ago, the National Academy said that Everglades restoration will increase the resilience of the ecosystem and the water management system and decrease their vulnerability. So while we're hearing more about this today, this has been recognized for quite some time as a valuable resilience builder. In the 2018 report, restoration is likely to create important benefits that increase the resilience of the ecosystem in face of a changing climate. Well, that's going to be the topic of our conversation today, and we've got four esteemed experts in the area of resilience and also in adaptive management as it applies to this restoration process. These four professionals represent a spectrum of agencies and academia and NGOs, and without further ado, I'd like to bring them up. Dr. Meenakshi Chhabra, she is ecosystem and resilient scientist at the Everglades Foundation. Dr. Gina Ralph, Chief of the Science Integration Branch at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Jacksonville District. Laura Reichold, Director, South Atlantic Division Regional Sediment Management Center of Expertise at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And last but not least, Dr. Tiffany Troxler, Associate Professor of Sustainability, Department of Earth and Environment, and Science Director of the Sea Level Solutions Center at FIU. Thank you. Well, let's jump right in. And so, again, going back to that tenet of Everglades restoration, sort of being founded on those principles of adaptive management, I'd like for Dr. Ralph to tell us what that means and what are the challenges in meeting objectives of adaptive management, not only conceptually, but as we move through time in planning these projects.
Sure. So thank you for having me. I'm Dr. Gina Ralph with the Corps of Engineers in Jacksonville. And so CERP was founded on, the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, or CERP, was founded on the premise of applied science and science continuing to inform decision making. And as part of that process, we have adaptive management. Adaptive management,
Don't push it.
is that better? Yep.
I don't know if it was turned on before.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Wow, okay. So starting over, the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan has an adaptive management framework. And as part of that framework, we continue to use science to inform our decisions. So it's a structured and iterative process in which we first start planning. We make our plans. We give the plans to our engineers who design them. We implement them, and then we need to monitor them. We need to identify specific indicators that are going to tell us whether or not we are achieving the desired restoration goals. And so we take that monitoring information that we learn and we assess it. Have we reached a certain threshold? Have we reached a trigger? Are we meeting the goals that have been outlined? And if we're not, then how do we get those benefits in which we envisioned? So as part of adaptive management, what we do is we have a monitoring program to address our uncertainties. We don't know what trajectory something might take. And so as we monitor it, we look for clues And the clues will tell us whether or not we need to implement a management option to better address that goal and reach success. And so we have various management options, and Dr. Davis wants to know, well, how do we take one of those management options and actually implement if we're not seeing restoration success in a manner in which we desired? So with the Corps of Engineers, we put in an adaptive management plan into any one of our documents for the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, which lays out different options that we can implement to address a specific uncertainty or to have a corrective action. And so some of those management options are really easy to implement. They may be something such as an operational change, in which we can tweak how we manage water throughout the system to attain a given goal. So those we can pretty much implement very easily. Other times we have structural approaches, and the structural approaches may be within our authority or they may not be within our authority. The Corps of Engineers doesn't do anything unless we have congressional authority to do it. So some of those options we may need to figure out, and this is a longer path, what authority we may have to implement that. We have certain things that Colonel Booth can implement within the district, but then we have others in which we need to go to our South Atlantic Division, and others in which we need to go back to Congress for full approval. So depending upon what it may be, we have an associated timeline, we have associated documentation, and we also have to transparently portray to all of our stakeholders the potential environmental consequences through documentation under the National Environmental Policy Act. So adaptive management, again, is iterative. It's based on science, and we use it to inform our decisions to always try to attain those restoration goals.
Thank you for that. And thinking about climate change, and I'm sure many of you noted the National Climate Assessment Report that was released today, and with that, we obviously gain more confidence in our understanding of what some of the outcomes are, and it's through time, it's a bit of a moving target in terms of how it affects the water budget of South Florida, how it affects temperatures. I'd like for both Gina, you and Laurel to speak to how that process of adaptive management is sort of viewed through this ever-changing lens of climate change, and how we can respond both within the Everglades on the peninsula, but also around our coastline.
So adaptive management for climate resiliency is just one piece of the puzzle. It's only going to get us so far. And so what we want to do when we're planning these restoration projects is we want to look at adaptive features. So how can we plan now for benefits we're going to accrue in the short term, and then knowing that we're going to have a change in sea level rise, what type of management options or structural or operational approaches will we need in the future? And can we structure our documents in such a way that we have an implementation sequencing? Because our projects take a long time to build, right? We're talking some of them 20 years it's going to take them to be built, constructed, and operational. So are there things that we may know if we are trying to backfill a canal to promote freshwater flow across the landscape? However, in the future, would we want to somehow manipulate that so that we can prevent against saltwater intrusion? Or do we need to add additional pumps because we may not have that groundwater, surface water elevational difference that we have now in order to further promote that sheet flow? So we really need to be thinking long term for what do we need now, what do we need 20 years from now, and then what do we need 50 years from now as part of our planning horizon, and then put that into our plans so that we already have congressional authorization. We don't have to go back and ask for it, and we can use that science that I spoke about through adaptive management to inform when we hit a certain trigger or an identified threshold in which we now need to implement that additional feature to help our projects continue to perform.
So good afternoon. Again, my name's Laurel Reichold. I work with the Corps of Engineers. I'm on the coastal side of things. I don't know much about the Everglades, but I do know a lot about resilience from our coastlines and how we can integrate important community resilience adaptations to make sure that, we are building features along our coastline to ensure, sustainability. From a flood risk management standpoint, the Corps of Engineers, we've been nourishing beaches, especially in Florida, for 50 years now. But what we know now from climate change and new models and new data is that, the way we engineer the beaches, how fast we can recover, these things are what changes. And these are the things that we have to start to implement into our designs. So the storm intensities, the storms are getting bigger. They're getting much more actually slower moving. And that slower moving really hurts our coastlines a lot more than it used to. So when we think about adaptations and we think about, long-term resiliency, it's not just maintaining the projects that we have today, but it's figuring out ways to adapt them to what's coming and understanding the intensities, the frequencies, the different elevations of water that we're going to have to deal with. So some of these flood risk management projects that we have, they need to be adapted in order to keep rise with sea level change and other intensities of hydro periods and whatnot. And so, when we spend a lot of time talking about, systems approach, it really is important that, it's not just a 50-year analysis. We're thinking longer term than that. The system itself, the planning horizons that we have, we can't limit ourselves. We have to think bigger than that. So that's going to be our biggest challenge coming up.
Thank you for that. And before we sort of move on, we've talked about resilience, and I think there's potentially some misunderstanding in terms of what resilience is. And, I scanned through the in brief of the National Climate Assessment Report today, and we're learning that we're seeing an erosion of resilience in not only our natural systems, but our communities. And I think it's important for us to have sort of a common understanding of what that means. And Tiffany, if you could speak to, what does resilience mean, whether for our natural systems or for our communities?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Tiffany Troxler. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Earth and Environment at FIU. So I've had the opportunity to do quite a bit of research in the Everglades along with some of my collaborators here in the room. And some of that work is focused on some sort of ecosystem level processes that help us to understand the vulnerability and the fate of our coastal or our freshwater and coastal wetlands as sea level continues to rise. And through a number of experiments, we were able to get a better handle on what sort of the limits are to some of our wetland communities in order to tolerate different levels of sea level rise that either contribute to the further development and growth of those wetlands or the transformation of those wetlands to a different ecosystem altogether, making them even less able to deal with things like extreme events or perturbations that we often see along our coastlines. And so for environmental resilience, it's largely about how those wetlands respond, adapt, absorb those extreme events or other perturbations that then allow them to continue to grow and maintain the types of ecological functions that we have come to expect from them, which is protecting our drinking water supply, protecting us from storms along the coastline, and supporting all of the recreational and economic benefits that the Everglades brings us. And we can think about human communities in a similar way. If we have a big storm that comes through, if we have extreme, flooding events in our neighborhoods, those can be to the level that it changes the nature of our communities and actually makes it harder to live in places like Miami, where we have, pretty extreme affordability crises going on right now. And so also with human communities, the way that we're able to protect and in fact promote quality of life for individuals within human communities is a way that we can build resilience, and actually through those actions improve opportunities for people living in communities like Miami-Dade, and actually across the U.S. The communities across the U.S. are facing these similar challenges. Thank you.
Thanks for that. And Meenakshi, I know you've been doing a lot of work in this area as well. So anything to sort of add to that, particularly on the community side?
Certainly, I would want to add to exactly what Tiffany said, that how, if for lack of a better word, I'm going to use the word comprehensive resilience for communities, for people. You can call it urban resilience or community resilience. It means having all aspects of resilience, social, economic, environmental, but needless to say that social and economic resilience is derived either for all material things that we need for social and economic resilience is derived from our environment, and even many of our non-material needs. And therefore, environmental resilience becomes like a precondition to community resilience. That's the first aspect. And we who live in South Florida know that Everglades restoration or resilience is the foundation for community resilience. And all these benefits that flow from our environment make us more resilient. But there is a caveat, and the caveat is that we have to determine that all these flows do reach the communities, the diverse communities that we have living here, anywhere in the country as such, but also in South Florida. And so it's very important to understand that equity and justice are inseparable and integral part of that comprehensive resilience. So it would be helpful to understand that by asking two questions. Just to begin with, resilience for whom? When we prioritize our ecosystems and environmental resilience, are we taking care that all the diverse communities are benefiting from those ecosystem service flows? Or are we just focusing on the same communities over and over again? By diverse communities, I mean across socioeconomic groups, and especially the marginalized people, whether historically marginalized like the native tribes and indigenous people, or those marginalized because of our current socioeconomic systems like race, color, class, migrant status, disabilities, and so on. So it's really important to understand equity and justice principles, apply them, and also resilience by whom? Is it the same club of elite people like us scientists or government planners who are deciding what is resilience going to look like, what are the goals, what are the means of achieving resilience? Because it is really a circle, because once you have all communities invested in environmental resilience, that is when environmental resilience also becomes a responsibility of all diverse communities and not just a few. So an Everglades restoration and resilience is also dependent on community resilience.
Thank you for that. And so thinking about restoration with sort of an eyes wide open approach to resilience, and I give the Army Corps just applause for incorporating now this eyes wide open approach to resilience with restoration planning. And BBCR is the project that's currently underway and has sort of a performance metric that's directly tied to this in the natural system. So Gina, can you speak to sort of how this is maybe the evolution of that and how it became incorporated into this planning process and sort of the prospects for that down the road with, say, Southern Everglades restoration planning and beyond?
Sure. So for our Biscayne Bay and Southeastern Everglades Restoration Project, or BBCR, we have a new performance measure. It's called the Adaptive Foundational Resiliency Performance Measure. And this was the brainchild of Dr. Fred Sklar with our partner agency, the South Florida Water Management District. And so as we started thinking about how are we going to capture benefits to our communities, our vegetation communities within the Everglades in light of sea level change, because we know that we would have benefits whether it was a sawgrass community, whether it was a salt marsh community, whether it was a mangrove community, in terms of retaining ecological benefits. But when we have a transgression to open water because we don't have sufficient flow in the alternatives that we model in order to help promote accretion and to help reduce the impacts of poor water salinity, then we have a very high likelihood that some of those vegetation communities are going to become open water. And it's not to say there are not benefits associated with nearshore communities. We are in no way, shape, or form not acknowledging those benefits. But in terms of providing resiliency benefits, we want these intact ecosystems to help not only provide their continued ecological functions for the benefit of the environment, but also to help with storm surge and resiliency to storm events, to help protect the built environment. So this Adaptive Foundational Resiliency Performance Measure, it's pretty savvy. We can actually change the elevation within the model that we're using, this regional simulation model, and we can adapt it to a unique alternative so that we can tell how fast certain communities will be accreting soil and how long we may have until they may transgress to open water with sea level change. So it's called the Adaptive Foundational Resilience. We will be applying this for the first time in BBCR, and we will adapt it for our Southern Everglades Restoration project, which will be start planning, I want to say around fourth quarter of fiscal year 24, so July, August, September timeframe. And we're very fortunate to have such minds, such as Dr. Sklar and Dr. Troxler, as partners in this endeavor to really use information and monitoring data that have been collected for many, many years through this LTER program to help provide the data to feed into the performance measures that help us evaluate plans and eventually select a plan that is going to perform well now as well as performing into the future.
And Laurel, obviously, when you're talking about, increasing soil elevation, use of, dredge material, I used to know it as beneficial use of dredge material. Now they're using the term thin layer placement, but it's not unlike beach renourishment. It's shoring up the land. Can you speak to, from your perspective, how sort of consideration of resilience goes into planning the projects that you are involved with around the coast?
Yeah, the Corps of Engineers nationwide dredges on an annual basis 200 million cubic yards of sediment. That's a lot of land. And what we do with that sediment has significant ramifications now and into the future. If we dispose of that material outside the system, in the ocean, we're not capturing sediment that could be used to increase elevations, could be used to, renourish mangroves that need sediment. And so, one of the things that we're focused on in the coastal side of the house when we are dredging is beneficially using that material. Thin layer replacement is one mechanism to get the sediment back into a marsh or mangrove type system in a very thin veneer. So it's basically the addition of the material back into the system, but in a very thin layer. We have had some trials with this on a smaller scale, and you look for the long-term benefit of it, because there is a short-term impact to where that material is being placed. So now we're thinking about different means and methods to get material back into the system using Mother Nature, tides and other types of hydrodynamic forcings to basically transport that sediment back into the system instead of maybe slurring it in or piping it in one sort of big lump. We're building islands. We're also putting lots of material onto the beaches. But from an agency perspective, we have a goal of achieving 70% beneficial use of dredged material by the year 2030. So of that 200 million cubic yards being dredged annually, our goal is to beneficially reuse 70% of that by the year 2030. So that would be again and again and again. Every year, we're turning over beneficially use of that material. A lot of the challenge is with the siltier sediments right now. From a sand granularity perspective, there's a lot of really easy uses for that material. When we start talking about the silts, finer material, that's where we have to start getting a little bit more creative. So from a resiliency perspective, we have a large-scale assessment right now of the South Atlantic Marsh corridor, looking at the sea level rise projections and the degradation of that marsh system, trying to focus in on where are the greatest opportunities where we can start sending silt pulses into these marshes to help them keep up with the rising sediment. And so I think there's probably very similar parallels to some of the efforts that you guys are doing with sea level change in the Everglade communities as we're looking at through the Intracoastal Waterway System and on our beaches.
Thank you. And obviously, these efforts transcend Everglades restoration. And I know many that sort of view Everglades restoration as sort of the foundation of resilience building for South Florida. But there are a variety of other efforts underway that Tiffany, Meenakshi, I know you've been involved with. The Back Bay study, as residents of Miami-Dade County, certainly come to mind. I wonder if you could speak to that, and I'll let you decide who goes first, but just how that fits into this larger sort of agenda of infrastructure, both gray and green, and how that sort of hinges off of our flood control system in South Florida.
So the Back Bay project is a coastal storm risk management project, and it began, its first study was completed in 2019 or 20. Okay, and it proposed seawalls along the shoreline to combat storm surge risk management, and as we all came to know later on in about when the first feasibility study was presented, it was received by the local government and the communities not happy with it, because these was hard infrastructure that was built along the shoreline, not taking care of the compound flooding, other flooding risks that were present and are present for communities over there. So it is, and I speak here from a normative point of view, that conventionally we have had across the Americas and in the world, we have a unidimensional approach to risk management, which means we combat or address hazards one by one, ignoring the systemic risks that our complex social ecological systems experience in this time of climate risks as we face them. What another point to be made is, and that was evident in the back-based study as well, is that we prioritize certain values over the others, right? And those values are economic. And we do that not because just the back-based study does that, but we do that as a system. We have a certain socioeconomic system. And those systems prioritize economic gains, and that's how we make our decision. But at the same time, we don't look into social and environmental benefits. So those were the reasons, those reasons prompted the local government to disagree with the decision of the Back Bay First study. And surprisingly enough, to the credit of the Corps, they came back and introspected and said, okay, we will not go further with the study, but reinitiate the back-based study, right? So, and that was, it was never, ever, it had never happened in the Corps history, I'm not sure, but it was for the good, because they were open to local communities weighing in their needs and priorities so that a new study could be initiated, and that would take care of social as well as environmental outcomes that are necessary to have an integrated risk management system that we need in Miami.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. In that process, there have been also means to identify other types of benefits that can come from such large investments like this coastal storm surge risk project. And so, some of the measures, they're structural measures, they're non-structural measures. Those non-structural measures are largely include elevating structures, homes, in areas that are difficult to protect from flooding because they're outside of the flood control system. And so there are opportunities to look at, through those investments, how do we improve environmental quality for Biscayne Bay? So for example, you may be familiar, we have a pretty significant septic system issue in Miami-Dade County. And one of the things that is being considered is, can we start to remove those septic tanks while we're also elevating those structures as sort of a win-win, generating additional co-benefits that directly benefit one of our major, in addition to the Everglades, resources in Miami-Dade County, which is Biscayne Bay. And another economic report was just released on the economic benefit of Biscayne Bay, the $64 billion that it's generating for our community and for the state. So the more that we can think about these opportunities to generate co-benefits when we're making these large investments, can only help us as, a larger community.
If I could add.
Sure, go right ahead, Laura.
Okay, well, I was going to say, the back-based studies from a coastal storm risk management perspective really are the next frontier. For the last 50 years, we figured out how to do our beachfront as our first line of defense. Now, the hazard is penetrating deeper into our back-based systems. We're getting flooding from behind. And so our ability to not only understand what the hazard can do, where are risks, where are the vulnerabilities, but as these ladies are mentioning, incorporating a hybrid approach to the solution is going to be the key. You can't just have maybe wetlands. That's not going to help you in a Category 5 storm. But you can't also just have a wall, because nobody wants to have that as part of their community. And so there has to be this balanced approach. And from the Corps' perspective, the tools, the engineering metrics, as well as the benefit side of the calculation are just as important. We have to understand, how can a wetland dissipate the wave energy? What's the magnitude? What size does it need to be? Just as much as we know our gray infrastructure can, what those parameters are. So it's the costs, the benefits, but also just like the parameterized metrics that we have to build into the engineering that this is the frontier. We're figuring this out as a community right now.
Well, I want to follow that thread there, because you referred to it as sort of that front line and that next line. And when you sort of add up these efforts, Everglades restoration, beach renourishment, these, the Back Bay study, and there are other efforts underway that the Water Management District is undertaking in partnership with the Corps associated with the CNSF project. And so, Gina, the Corps has brought together these efforts to some degree through an integration of sorts. Could you speak to that? Because I think that's really exciting to be able to think of these efforts sort of holistically and how benefits from one translate to another.
Sure. And I think it gets back to Laurel's point earlier about comprehensive planning. So it's not just one of these elements, whether it's a Back Bay study, whether it's Everglades, whether it's one of our coastal storm risk management projects where we're nourishing a beach. We need redundancy. We need several lines of defense. And so the Corps in Miami-Dade County has this new integration team in which all of the ongoing studies that the Corps of Engineers is sponsoring, studies and ongoing construction efforts, there's now a team, an integration team, to talk across those business lines, to be able to share science, to be able to share the metrics, to be able to share the modeling tools, to help us first to identify what are the issues so that we could build solutions. And one of the really important things that Laurel was getting at is the fact that we need to understand from the engineering perspective what is going to give us the best bang for our buck, because it all comes down to, how much of a benefit can we get with the cost that we are providing within these areas. And so fortunately, when you were speaking about comprehensive benefits, in the original Back Bay for Miami, we didn't have the ability to simply add comprehensive benefits. We simply had to follow the old formula of what do you do to have national economic development benefits. And now we have more tools available to us to look comprehensively across what are the environmental benefits, what are the economic benefits, what are the flood risk benefits that we're gaining from these. So this integration team talks across all of the projects. It brings the science, it brings lessons learned, it brings adaptive management principles across the board so that we can look comprehensively about how do we have redundancy to build resiliency.
Thank you for that. And there's been mention of benefits and co-benefits, and I want to sort of dig in on the metrics side because obviously that's an important consideration when these efforts are being planned. And Tiffany, I'm going to start with you. Think of the level of investment being made here. Ensuring benefits is critical. What are some of the resilience metrics that are sort of essential with these projects, whether it's near coast or even in the Everglades?
Yeah, thanks. So, I'll just say that for Everglades restoration and resilience, we're well positioned because we've been monitoring out there for decades. The district, the Corps, the Park Service have all been funding monitoring to help us understand how we're moving the needle with regard to adaptive management. And so what I think about is what we can learn from adaptive management and the processes that we've implemented to restore the Everglades for our urban communities. How can we get the monitoring established so that we know whether we're achieving our goals with urban resilience investments? And, it's a more comprehensive set of metrics that we need, in part because these urban resilience investments are affecting individuals in their neighborhoods. So we have to take an even more granular approach to understanding whether we're moving the needle in terms of building resilience. And so some of those metrics, could include, employment rates. It could include, wages. It could include whether homeowner or whether families have access to after-school programs for their kids so that they have time to go find a job to help improve their economic position in life. So it becomes maybe an even more complicated approach to understanding how we're and if we're moving the needle. But it's just as important as all of the decades of monitoring that we've been doing in the Everglades. And I'd like to, talk more about how we can learn from what we've done, and particularly in terms of adaptive management for building urban resilience.
If I may add.
Yes. And then we're going to go to Q&A. I want to make sure we save time for that.
Okay, so I'm just going to add that what the resilience metrics for urban communities, we can list some and name some, but the best way to find what those metrics would be through inculcating more participatory mechanisms into our decision making that inform us. That is very essential to adaptive management. That is open decision making, bring in diverse partners to the table and democratically use their knowledge and not just bring people to the table, but break down power structures, and so that everyone is able to contribute their vision for the world, their perspectives, and those diverse ideas should inform our decision making and then need to be applied to restoration or resilience actions. And so just one more thing, so some of us recognize that these environmental and social equity outcomes, when they're not in resilience building mechanisms and assessments, like a team of some scientists along with me, Dr. Troxler here, and some other scientists in FIU and the University of Miami, we developed a practical guide for an alternative valuation framework and a self-evaluation tool for urban planners as well as project managers for resilience investments. It's got a nice acronym, so it's called MIRIA.
It's got to be better than CISRP.
Better than CISRP. It's called Mainstreaming Ecosystems and Equity in Resilience Infrastructure Assessments, wherein project managers can be guided to incorporate considerations of equity as well as environment when they are carrying on any public project that has the people as well as resilience incorporated into it. So this practical guide, it mirrors the project cycle that we're also familiar with. So it goes along with it, and at each phase, it adds criteria for ecosystem services as well as procedural and distributional equity. That is, creating processes that are representative, inclusive of people, as well as distributional tools and methodologies and technical guidance on how we can incorporate all the flow of benefits that we have from resilience, reach different people equitably. And this holistic valuation it's normative, that is, and this rubric is normative, and it can help us create better directions or better aim and objectives and follow that as such. So hoping to introduce that soon for peer review and for everyone's use very shortly.
Great. Well, I want to thank the panel and have time for any questions that our audience might have for this group. I can continue. Please.
You spoke often about adaptive management, and given the nature of, I'm going to call it the climate crisis, regardless of what you think about that, given the nature of that, how do you plan? You have particular projects that go on for 50 years, maybe 100 years, 25 years. How do you kind of take in those extreme events, and then how do they kind of change your decision making throughout the next 10 to 15 years, or just within that particular project?
Yeah, I can give an example of that. So on the beach side, we introduce the increased intensities of storms into our modeling. So that would give us an indication, is the erosion going to increase, decrease? Are we going to need more sand in order to renourish the beach to continue to sort of create the project so that it performs as designed? So the way our beaches work is they're supposed to erode, right? They're a sacrificial berm. But we have to have the sand there before the storm in order for it to protect the infrastructure behind it. So one of the things we do is make sure that we're understanding the frequency and the necessity of the volume and how much we're going to have to be able to bring that sand, put it back onto the beach. Do we have to increase dune elevation? Do we have to increase the berm dimensions? And so a lot of it goes into long-term planning for making sure we understand where to get the material. So we've got a source of material. We know how much capacity we have so that it covers sort of the projected need. So that's just one example on the coastal side. I'll let maybe Gina talk Everglades.
So for the Everglades, what we include in each one of our projects is an adaptive management plan. And we're doing this right now with our Biscayne Bay and Southeastern Everglades project, where we have a group of scientists, engineers, planners in a room together, and we're identifying uncertainties. What don't we know now? And how can we adjust for that in the future? So we will include the uncertainties that can be affected by our project. And so as part of that, we will identify triggers and thresholds, and then options. If this happens, then we can do A, B, or C to combat that. So we plan that in our horizon, 50-year planning horizon. We are also, because of where BBCR is located, we are planning for different projections of sea level change. So we have a medium curve, which we're using. We've adjusted that for values based on data right at Vaca Key. So it's informed by the near, within our project footprint. It's informed by that data and information. But we're not stopping there with just planning for that. We're also projecting, well, what if we're at this higher curve? What do we do then? How will our project perform? What type of adaptive features can we include in that adaptive management plan to help reduce those uncertainties and acknowledge if we hit a certain trigger or threshold, we have a plan in place to do it.
How does that work when you're taking into account different species? Like, are you looking at, I don't know, like a keystone species and saying, well, there's supposed to be 150,000 alligators, and now there's 75,000. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in this. How are you taking into account those particular indicators, those KPIs, to give you the best indications of what you should be doing over the next 10 to 15 or 20 or 5 or 2 years?
So SERP is all about hydrology. So SERP is meant to change the quantity, quality, timing, and distribution of flows. So we use indicators to let us know, are we succeeding in reaching restoration goals? And we do have alligators as an indicator. But what we're trying to understand is, do we have the correct hydro period to support the characteristic vegetation in which these animals live? And if we have the water to provide for the needs of a specific vegetation community, that's what we can affect by SERP. We can't make the alligators come, but we can make the conditions conducive for them to come. So hopefully that addresses that question.
Well, Gina, would you say that incorporating climate change and sea level rise into the adaptive management process has driven, in part, a resilience based approach rather than, species being in the right place at the right time. It introduced a sort of another level of yeah.
Absolutely. And we don't expect the species to be static. As climate changes and sea level rises, we're going to have a migration. We're hoping that we can have the conditions right to provide habitat somewhere within our spatial footprint in the future.
Yeah. Great question.
Other questions?
Yes.
All right, thank you. Hi, so my name is Carmen. Thank you all for being here today. I thought, well, you said it was very informative and interesting. So I know most of you emphasize like adaptability and adaptive management overall. So my question to you is, how do you plan or how do you propose to find like a cultural balance or stability while improving adaptability to like rising global geographic challenges, especially to those who are unaware or may not have the resources necessary to understand how to actually strategize to adaptability?
First of all, awareness and education are really important. So lots of people don't know about the environmental resilience or that we are generating in South Florida because of Everglades restoration. For example, people didn't know, most people who were surveyed don't know that their water comes from the Everglades, right? So questions as such, even for climate risks, we do not know many communities do not know what climate risks they are facing. And so your question is really, what do we do about them, right? So that is, again, I might be sounding like that, same thing, repeating it all over again, is inclusion of people, awareness, and including them in all forms of decision making for underserved communities. And if we are planning any resilience activities, understanding that this is going to impact people, we need to prioritize our underserved communities if we have any restoration or resilience projects. Especially, that's what happens when I was mentioning about economic systems and prioritizing economic benefits. So what happens is we have a tendency to do a benefit cost analysis, which says the highest valued properties will be the ones who will be protected if we build a seawall or a storm surge gate, right? And that is because of our, again, economic systems that we have. So, but not understanding that economic viability is important, but also, like Gina, you said about giving equal importance to social outcomes and environmental outcomes when we make decisions about which project to be selected. So prioritizing underserved communities when selecting projects, planning resilience projects is key.
I'll add, just from a flood risk, type of standpoint, you have community awareness and education is really important. When you go to buy a house and you're in a flood zone, you get a pretty good understanding of that. You're in a FEMA flood zone, X, Y, Z. But taking it a step further, if we start to understand these flood zones are changing, they're increasing, it really is upon municipality, state, federal agencies to either set new laws, new building standard zones, or make sure that that information is somehow being disseminated. I heard that FEMA has come out with new type of, programs to help from a funding perspective, recovery. In certain flood zone type stuff. So setting up programs like this where funding is accessible and readily easy for communities to recover. We know it's going to happen. Let's make sure that we've got provisions set up to help these communities when it does. So, it's not going to be a surprise when we have a major flood because we already knew this zone was prevalent to it. So I think making sure we've got the right policies in place, access to funding, availability to help the communities is also really important.
Well, I think we have time for one more.
my question is, given that the focus of this event is on science communication and restoration, and you were bringing up, of course, the gap, right, the lack of awareness, how are you tackling that insofar as messaging, especially because so many of the students here today are so interested in science communication? What would you suggest the messaging be going forward? Is it a message of looking back at what we've lost, a message of hope and steps of what they can take, and the explanations surrounding how it impacts not just locally, but even at a national level?
I completely agree. Messaging is so important. And at the Everglades Foundation, we do a lot of that, bringing to light the value of Everglades restoration to resilience. So that is our, area. And at the same time, reaching out to people more. Outreach is therefore very important. Again, going back to equity principles, making sure that all projects that we undertake have procedural equity right at the beginning. And those procedural equity principles says that have people come together, have surveys, focus groups, and during that, people who are the planners or project managers, they need to know those communication principles, which you teach fantastically at FIU, I know. Yes.
Well, anyone else chime in on that just quickly, and then we'll have to wrap.
It was there.
I'll say one little thing. Know your audience.
It was one thing.
Communications 101. Right, Sean?
Oh, I was going to say community ownership. So, science, communicating science is one thing, but having some of the best projects, the most successful projects I've ever seen, the community had ownership in the success of that project. Not just the success of it, but why they were doing it, why it was being done, what the outcomes were going to be. So the ownership of the community in those projects, I think, is hugely, hugely important to success.
And
Oh, thank you. I just want to say, as a scientist, sometimes we're challenged to communicate science and to communicate it so that our managers understand what we're trying to tell them. And so that's one of the things that we work with all the time within restoration, coordination, and verification, or RECOVER, which is the science arm of the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan. What is the best way to communicate science so that it can be implemented and it could be understood and we can apply lessons learned? So that's my challenge to the younger students here, to really figure that out and to help us to communicate better so that we can continue to have science shape and inform all of the decisions we make.
Well, on that, we're going to wrap. I just want to say that with Everglades Restoration, sort of bringing this full circle, we're blessed to have the talent, the capacity, and the relationship between the South Florida Water Management District, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, obviously an engaged group of stakeholders, and other agencies, Interior, it's both state and federal level involved with this. We're on the right track, but we need to maintain the progress, the trajectory that we've built over the last several years. And if I've learned anything from just digesting the science and these reports over the years, that knowing what we know about climate change and sea level rise, it's not changing our course at all. It just means that we need to move faster. And obviously science and monitoring, that was a key message in this, that science and monitoring are key to ensuring that we're on the right track and allowing us to adapt as needed. So thank you all for attending. And again, thank you, Carlos, for the opportunity to have this wonderful panel. Yep, thank you.
Thank you all. We have just a few more minutes because we wanted to give you another update in a segment. Carlos Becerra with FIU. To underscore what Leah Goodman mentioned earlier, welcome all to your center in Washington, D.C. Although it's powered by FIU, the vision here is that this powers our partners as well, and you always have a place to call your own. On that note, I do want to give a special shout out to your team. You've probably met many of them, our team, Nicole Regalado, Daniel Chavez, Michelle Trochet, Brandon Miranda. They've been helping us execute today. Of course, our amazing partners, the Everglades Foundation, Keely, Brad, Steve, and I know Eric would have loved to have been here, but obviously with board meetings happening tomorrow. Here in DC, our mission is threefold. We're here to advocate, yes, for our FIU faculty researchers, but those researchers, as we all know, are very much engaged with community partners and key national and global challenges. On that note, you've met some of them already, but I do want to give a special shout out to Evelyn Geiser, who's been leading important work for decades in the Everglades. Dr. Maria Mayor just asked a key question with our Office of the Provost and has helping us lead in a lot of science communications work. And Mario Loyola, in the back row there, also related to the Institute of Environment, is helping us lead our environmental finance and risk management program. We're here to support our students like Leah. Round of applause for Leah, of course. And of course, provide a platform for our partners to convene as we're doing today. We invite you as the reception begins, and it's going to be another 15, 20 minutes, to experience some of our displays, our research showcase. You're going to meet some of the students up here, but none of the themes, and although we advocate for population health, STEM education, Latin America and the Caribbean, a lot of our international work, no theme is near and dear to our heart as the Everglades, for obviously it's a treasure that we all share. On that note, I know that we've also been joined by some special guests. Deputy Assistant Attorney General Lisa Russell, I see here with us in the audience. Superintendent Pedro Ramos, Everglades National Park, thank you for joining us. And Ron Bergeron, Governing Board Member of the South Florida Water Management District, thank you for joining us. So let me bring back to the front of the space here, Dr. Todd Krall has been leading a lot of our great collaborative advocacy work and research with the Institute. Todd?
Thanks very much, Carlos. I want to thank the panel and Steve again one more time and the Everglades Foundation. That was really a terrific discussion. It's pretty remarkable when you think about the fact that the Everglades Restoration Program is one of the largest in the world, and Florida and Miami in particular is one of the largest and most vulnerable cities in the world. So virtually everything we do and everything we've just talked about is scrutinized by the world, right? So we can't really fail, right? We have no option but to succeed. In addition to the Everglades restoration, which FIU's been long known for, we've been really successful recently at working closely with our Florida legislature. And again, I thank Carlos and the team and having a space here where we can have open dialogues and discussions with staffers. And I think there are some staffers here today. Thank you guys for coming. We've sort of expanded our approach and our partnership and our collaborative capabilities through congressional earmarks and other kinds of collaborations and partnerships. And I'll just take a few minutes. I know I'm between you and the bar, so I'll be very brief. But some of our more recent collaborations, and again with support from our Florida legislature, many of you know about the horrific building collapse that occurred in South Florida not too long ago, and there's been more and more talk, which I'm happy to hear that there's talk about, sort of the issue with Everglades restoration and saltwater intrusion and the protection of our drinking water, right? So saltwater intrusion needs to be on our minds, not just from a drinking water perspective, but also from a structural integrity perspective, as we saw a year and a half ago. One of our newest projects is to put in a series of transects from Miami-Dade all the way up past West Palm and these are saltwater intrusion monitoring transects, so that we can start to understand what the conditions are in which we get saltwater intruding not only into our groundwater and our groundwater wells, which we're already measuring saltwater intrusion in some of them, but also to understand this dynamic of saltwater getting underneath our foundations and interacting with the groundwater and causing these erosion characteristics that we really weren't aware of and weren't able to predict. So this is a big new project. It'll span again from Miami-Dade County all the way up past West Palm, and these are some of the spots, and these will be highly instrumented. And they will be instrumented in a way to provide real-time data so that not only can we develop new predictive models and understand that interaction between the saltwater, sea level rise, our underlying geology, and the construction characteristics of where we're building buildings, but that we can use that, and communication and education has been a big theme today, so that we can use that information to inform people, to educate folks, and to involve stakeholders and communities so that they can own this data and understand what's happening in their neighborhood, and to start making good decisions about policy making and maybe where and when we need to change sort of our building permitting approaches and stuff like that. So this is a brand new project. We're just in the planning phases of that, but stay tuned. That this will be a really important and first of its kind series of transects where we have really fine scale data and again, real time. And speaking of real time, let's bring that. Speaking of real time. Speaking of real time. Are they stuck? Many of you have heard about the buoy system that we have been putting into Biscayne Bay. Again, this has been supported by the National Science Foundation, by private donors, folks in the Biscayne Bay area that own companies. This allows us to provide, again, real-time data in Biscayne Bay associated with water quality that we're using to make different kinds of decisions in terms of Biscayne Bay and how we're trying to monitor Biscayne Bay. And so if you haven't gone to the FIU buoy site, do that. We've got a whole series of these, and our most recent congressional earmark, again with Florida congressional support, was to take these buoys that we've built and operate for water quality, real-time water quality in Biscayne Bay, but now to develop new technologies so that we can measure and predict harmful algal blooms at much finer scales and much more dilute concentrations than have been done before. We're pretty lucky in the southeast. We don't have the big harmful algal blooms that they have in the west coast, but they're coming. And we've had a few big ones down in the Keys, and they're starting to move into our neck of the woods. So we're developing some new technologies to basically be able to measure those harmful algal blooms before they become a health hazard to small children, and so we can send out warning systems. And only Carlos would take one of our decommissioned buoys and turn it into one of the most expensive bar tables that you'll ever see, because he has developed this to take off the solar radiation and put a glass top on it where he can have cocktails. Only Carlos would come up with something like that. So this is now affectionately known as
David Bowie.
David Bowie. And so, but we have a whole series of these, and again, we continue to develop those. And then along these lines of real-time data, better sensor networks, it's time to start using autonomous vehicles and be able to collect much more water quality data up and down the coast, again in real time, much more comprehensively, much more in a way to allow for more quick adaptive management. And so we've just been provided with $9 million to build a brand new robotics and autonomous vehicle center on the Biscayne Bay campus. So we're really excited about that. So thank you again.
And I'll just add, first off, that same glass top can be used as a very nice laptop table for our students and faculty members. And this was your idea, by the way. I see several staffers out here. There's too many to name individually, but as was pointed out today, talk about a bipartisan at all level in these days, not a wedge issue, but an issue that brings folks together, the Everglades. And these projects would not have been possible without our members of Congress, both in the Senate, both senators, and in our case, definitely our South Florida members, for really going to the mat. By means of update, many of you might have heard, South Florida, which is Palm Beach, Miami-Dade, Broward, and Monroe, led by Miami-Dade County, was recently designated by the Department of Commerce and the EDA for a climate technologies hub. So we've passed the first hurdle. Now, these 4 counties, about 6 or 7 university partners, startup companies are going to be focused on submitting proposals to draw down more money. We see this all as an added related tool in our chest for Everglades restoration and how FIU and the entire region can look at this. And I want to introduce Philip Drujak with Miami-Dade County. He leads their Washington team. So this is going to be front and center for us for the next few months and many more years. So back to Leah.
Yeah, so I want to thank again our panelists for their invaluable insight on applying adaptive management strategies to coastal resilient projects. On that note, I would also like to acknowledge our 20 amazing FIU students here on a 3-day Future of the Everglades fly-in, if you haven't met them already. And now that we're concluding and the networking begins, I want to make sure that we have a chance to meet our amazing 4 of the Everglades Foundation Fellows who will have their poster presentations on our interactive wall. So let me invite them up to introduce themselves. Dakota Lewis from the University of Central Florida. If they're here with us. All right, around here. Hi. So again, Dakota Lewis from University of Florida. Okay, and then real quick, 3 more. So George Zaragoza from the University of Central Florida. Chloe Vorsa from Florida International University. And again, another incredible FIU student, Thomas Shannon. Okay.
So these 4 amazing individuals, they're going to be by their poster presentations on the interactive wall as we have our networking reception, so please experience a lot of their research.
Yeah, great. So now, before we leave today, please be on the lookout for a nice little takeaway bag that we have, which has in it our inaugural FIU Research magazine. Should we display on the screen? Let's do a little flip through. It's pretty nice. Awesome. Perfect. So it's super exciting. As we flip through here, we see a lot of great info. We have Dr. Crowell, front and center. And of course, Chloe Vorsa. Yeah. So I actually was lucky enough to meet Chloe on last March's Women in Science Communications fly-in. So these fly-ins were just very cool and full circle. So aside from the magazine, we also have a beautiful photo print of the Everglades by John Bob Carlos and a 3D printed mangrove. And Dr. Troxler, I know you were involved in that project. Would you care to share a bit? Okay. Well, I know, yeah. She would if she was here. So it's amazing. We all know how cool she is. Yeah, please.
So this is really cool. David Lagomasino, who was a graduate student at FIU, he's now at East Carolina University. He developed this before they had them. I think he developed this sort of 3D scanner, took it out to a mangrove forest, worked around a mangrove tree, a single red mangrove tree, and created a file that, with some cleaning up, was able to be 3D printed now en masse. And it's, as far as I know, the only 3D printed mangrove in the world. And so it's very cool to have.
Yeah, FIU is pretty one of a kind. So thank you very much, everybody, and enjoy the reception and continue to count on both the Everglades Foundation and FIU to advance the mission of restoration.
Oh, are you coming in? That's right.
I'm doing well. Good to see you. You know, I'm looking out in the audience. And